All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here. It's really good to be back. And as I said a week ago Sunday when I preached, thanks for the study leave. I spent 6 weeks, 50 hours a week writing. That's all I did, write. It was wonderful. And I'm going to share what I was writing and even a little excerpt from it. But if you have been in these Monday night classes for some years back, you may remember that I did a thing I think I called it the 7 last words of the Christ, or the 7 first words of the Christ, or some such thing. Well, this is a reprise of that, and it's built off of that, and it's like 100 degrees, 180 degrees different from what it was. So even if you were there and can remember every word, this will be fresh, I promise. I called it because, they asked me for a title for this way back, and I called it Jesus' Vision for a Flourishing Life. And flourishing is a really popular word right now in psychology, sociology, biblical studies, ethics. It's everywhere. Sometimes it's sort of the antonym of languishing. There's a lot of nuance to the word, but there's not a lot written about Jesus' vision for a flourishing life. And as it turns out, that was one of the titles or subtitles among 100 of them that I had for this book. But instead, I ended up with a different title. And so here's my title: Your One Wild and Precious Life, subtitled, What Jesus Can Teach Us About Life Before Death. If I have my way, the publisher will use this Van Gogh with the sower on it. And I don't have graphic artist abilities, but that's the title and the subtitle. When you open the book, here will be 2 quotes. I came so that they may have life and have it abundantly, Jesus of Nazareth. And Mary Oliver, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So that's where that poetry and Jesus comes together. And I start basically with 2 theses. One is, I don't think Jesus came to die. There's a lot of Christianity that believes he came to die. That's his purpose. It's in artwork, it's in hymnody, it's in the creeds. Everything's about his dying. I don't think that's the case. That's not how I read it. I think he came to live, and for how he lived, he was put to death. And there's a difference. Now, when I say that, there are teachings in the Bible that say he came to die. And there are teachings in the Bible that say, no, he didn't come to die. So they have different theologies. I just don't subscribe to the one that his purpose was to die. The second is, I don't think we were born just to die either, but to live. And so I think, this is really about his vision of flourishing for our one wild and precious life. And in my opinion, even if Christianity, has both of these voices about death and life, I think we're disproportionately focusing on his death. How Great Thou Art, sung at all the funerals. And when I think that God, his Son, not sparing, sent him to die, I don't go there. It's not what I think Jesus was sent to do. And I think even the theologians who would say, yes, that's what he came to do, would say, that's not the only thing he came to do. I mean, after all, if that were the case, there's a lot of pages in the Gospels we don't need. We could just skip to the back. What difference would it make if he told a parable or said a beatitude? I mean, he came to die, so let's just look at his death. We don't know about the first 30 years, so to speak, but we've got 3 good years of material if we're going to trust the chronology of the Gospels. So rather than focus on his 7 last words, and if you don't know this, it's a pretty common kind of theme in Lent leading up to Easter. There's books written. There's some really good books written about the 7 last words, and there's some Bible studies and all kinds of things. So sayings like, it's finished, Father forgive them, today you'll be with me in paradise, all those sayings. I chose instead to call, and I'm just naming them this, the 7 first words of the Christ. I don't have in mind, like when he's 2 and he finally finds his vocabulary and says, something to Mary or Joseph. I don't mean that at all. So here's what I do mean. Actually, before I get to it, I wanted to see what you think. If you had to name, and so this sort of gives away part of it, if you had to name an essential story or stories or an essential teaching, that's what I mean by first. If you had to name something that you would nominate, you say, well, Mike, if you named 7 of these, I sure hope you included, what would make your list? Anybody, anything. Yeah?
Good Samaritan.
Good Samaritan, okay?
Woman at the well.
Woman at the well.
Zacchaeus.
Zacchaeus, okay?
Beatitudes.
Beatitudes.
Just the instructions about love and about forgiveness.
Love and forgiveness. It's hard to argue with these, right? I mean, they're in the Gospels. So when you take this crazy amount, because it's a big body, if you just took parables, for instance, there's like 40 parables. If you just took healing stories, if you just took, whatever it is, there's so much. So when you say, okay, let's get this down to 7, well, you got hard work ahead. Here's my criteria. I use 2 criteria, since I called it first words. Placement. If it comes early in the Gospels, maybe we're supposed to pay attention to that. In ancient rhetoric, the writers of the New Testament would know this. What comes first, what comes last, and sometimes what's in the smack dab middle, not always, those are meant to be, oh, you should pay attention to this. The one that comes first, of course, is this notion of primacy, as rhetoricians call it. So some of what I've chosen, it comes early. And you can't help but think, well, if it comes early, they must have wanted us to get this, right? In some ways, it would even stand for all that's to come. Okay, so for instance, Jesus' sermon at Nazareth. It's one of the first things he does in the Gospel of Luke. Goes home, preaches a sermon. Second criteria I used was prominence. It may not come first, but it's emphasized. The authors have emphasized it. And the classic example for me has always been the feeding of the 5,000. 6 times. It's in all 4 Gospels. It's the only miracle story in all 4 Gospels. And it occurs twice in Matthew and Mark. So it'd be really hard to say that we shouldn't include this when it is the only one that is in all 4 and has 6 versions of it. They're never identical, but it's kind of hard to argue with that one. You can if you want to, but so here's the 7 that I came up with. Follow me, and I call that studying under Jesus. A lot of people would call that discipleship. It's interesting, the word discipleship does not occur in the New Testament. Disciples do. Jesus calls somebody to be a disciple, and we're going to look at that. But the noun discipleship doesn't really. And as we'll look at, I think this phrase studying under Jesus really captures it. When you hear that, studying under Jesus, what comes to your mind? In any other field, what comes to mind? Student. Nothing else? Mastership. Mentorship. Yes. Yeah, it's kind of, and I'll talk about this later, it's kind of like if you studied under a musician. Yeah, there's some technique, but there's also a way of life. You need to understand that there's a way of life. Yeah? Apprentice, yes. That really gets right at the heart of the Greek word that's used. I mean, disciple in Greek means student. But when you look at the broader use of it, it's really someone who's apprentice, someone who's being mentored, someone who's taking on their way of life, not just taking notes and saying, okay, you said this and you said that. Second one is good news to the poor. That's the sermon in Luke 4 when he's at the synagogue in Nazareth. And I simply subtitled that Justice for the Most Vulnerable. It's bigger than just the poor, but we'll talk about it. Blessed are thee. So that's the Beatitudes, which I called what the good life really looks like. You give them something to eat. That's the 5 or the 6 feeding stories. Your faith has made you well. That's the healing stories. So you see what I've done there? Instead of picking one, I've taken this whole genre of healing or feeding. the kingdom of God is like, and so this is a parables chapter. And yes, the Good Samaritan does get included. And I called it when God is in charge, because those start with the kingdom of God is like, which in Greek you could also translate the empire of God, parentheses, as opposed to the emperor or the Caesar, is like this. So these are a contrast when God is in charge. And then the last one, with kudos to Charmin, who's not here, but I told her about this. When I taught the 7 first words, whatever many years ago it was, and sort of filed away, someday I'd write a book about this, I didn't have this one, love of God and neighbor. And you're like, how could you not have love? Well, it doesn't occur early. It doesn't even occur a lot. But Charmin convinced me, because the more I looked at it, it's called the first and the great commandment. If it's the great commandment, even if it's not all over the pages, and even if it doesn't come first, kind of hard to argue with something that's called the great commandment by both Jesus and his critics when he has the debate. And what got dropped out, in case you're wondering, were Sabbath stories, what it means to keep Sabbath or to violate Sabbath for a good cause. So, anyway, any responses to any of that, or challenges, or thoughts, or questions?
So your revised means from where you were a long time ago?
We're in that other class.
Yeah, just, I mean, if you give me 8, I'd put Sabbath in, but I named 7, and so, yeah. But yeah, it's just, I was convinced. Charmin, she convinced me.
I don't know how you didn't put it first.
Well, yeah. Anyone else?
Are these, are these a listed priority? Are these?
The only thing that I really thought about in terms of order is, follow me is the very first thing that happens. He calls disciples. And then they follow him, and this is what happens. And then, the synagogue sermon and the Matthew Beatitudes, you can't really say which one comes first chronologically, so you just pick. But then the middle two, I guess it's the middle two, 4 and 5, those are linked a lot of times. They're both, the healing and the feeding are linked. So, yeah, I mean, there's some rhyme or reason at places, and then there's just, okay, it had to go somewhere. And in some ways, what I thought about the love one was that it sort of, in some ways, says this stands over it all. Okay, so here's the plan. We're going to look at this kind of introduction and the first saying, this notion of following Jesus. Next week we'll look at 2, 3, and 4, and then the week after that, the last 3, as well as kind of wrap up a conclusion. But I am going to read a little bit of a sample for you. And this is the introduction. So if you pick up the book, this is the first thing you're going to read. There's a quote at the top. The quote says, "There is more that is important about Jesus than his death." But this is how the book starts. Sanibel Island off the Gulf Coast of Florida is not the kind of place where people go to die. It is the kind of place where some people go to live, others to live it up, to get away for a few days, or if they're lucky, a few months every winter. It was there on that lovely island on a beautiful warm day in December of 2021 that I read an early draft of this book to a dying man, Phil Love. Phil and his wife Patty are dear friends and have been for years. I've known them for so long that I no longer recall how we first met, but I do remember when Phil retired early from business and went to seminary, where I had him in some of the classes. I also recall Phil falling in love with golf in his retirement, the two of us playing lots of rounds together. I remember the Loves gifting me and my wife with a lovely painting by the artist John Sloan, a piece way out of our budget, although gratefully displayed in our home ever since. And there's a really funny story if you want to hear it sometime. Phil and Patty are generous people, so generous that they offered to pay my way to another paradise in the summer of 2019, this one on the West Coast, Malibu. Besides being home to the rich and famous, Malibu is the home of Pepperdine University, which was sponsoring a conference called A Life Worth Living, including faculty from Yale, Notre Dame, and other schools scattered around the states. The focus was on an undergraduate course in which students wrestle with what a life worth living looks like. Yale's Center for Faith and Culture pioneered it, one of the most popular on their campus. Some years after Phil graduated from seminary, he went to work with the center at Yale. So taken were he and Patty with that program and that course, they envisioned something like it for people at all stages of life, not just undergraduates. So they sent me to Pepperdine to see what might develop. So I talk a little bit about that because if you did the Life Worth Living course, that's what came out of it. And for those who don't know, Phil was a longtime member here, and Patty still is. So I'd briefly say that my job was much harder than the people that were there because they were planning undergraduate courses with papers, and I was trying to figure out how to do something else. So then I say, the book you hold in your hand draws from that course, but with a twist. I'm trained as a biblical scholar, which is to say, while I enjoy reading philosophy and social psychology and draw on some of that in this volume because wisdom can be found in many places, I think primarily in terms of biblical passages. Stories from the Bible are my thing. In this case, narratives that invite us to ponder what a life worth living might look like. My model then is the life of Jesus, and I do mean his life. So then I talk just a little bit about what I've already said, how you drive past churches and you see crosses. You don't see an image of bread and fish, which is what he fed the people in the wilderness. I'd love for that to be the primary icon of Christianity, but it's not. And then the how great thou art, etc. So then, let's see. Okay, so the second facet of this book is an extension of the first. Jesus wasn't born just to die, and neither were we. I don't know anyone who'd say the purpose or measure of a life is how that person died or how any of us will die. That point hit me especially hard when reading to Phil, who was dying down in Florida. Surely the generous life he lived before he died counted for something. The time he spent with Patty and their 2 children and grandchildren, his corny puns among friends, his love of good red wine, his colorful bow ties, which I've been wearing because Patty gave me a bunch of those, his participation in the life of the church, this one, that he cherished. Phil even put his pilot's license to use with an organization called Angel Flight, volunteering to fly persons needing medical treatments to faraway cities. Surely these things mattered. Surely our lives matter, not just our deaths. So this notion of a life worth living reminds me of Chloe Benjamin's poignant novel, The Immortalists. It's the summer of 1969 when men are walking on the moon, Vietnam is in full throttle, and full-throated hippies are getting stoned at Woodstock. The Gold family's world takes shape in New York City's Lower East Side, where the 4 adolescent children hear about this psychic who has moved into the neighborhood. It's not just that she can say whether you'll have a good marriage or horrible job, that sort of thing. All kinds of fortune tellers claim to do that, read your palm. No, this woman can tell you when you will die, down to the very day and year. So the 4 of them pay a visit to this mysterious woman. Varya, the oldest of the 4 children, will live longer than any of them, dying in her late 80s. But she doesn't give herself to really living. All her life, she denies herself the pleasures of this world, positing the theory as a scientist that eating the bare minimum, for example, leads to a longer life. But as an old woman, she realizes if she had to do it over, she wouldn't visit the fortune teller. No, what she would do is live life to the full, really live, no matter how long that life might add up to. She would pay attention to the smell of her sister Clara's hair, revel in the feel of her brother Daniel's arms, take better care of her brother Simon, who lived a hard life after coming out gay. She would forgive those who hurt her, find a husband, maybe start a family of her own. It's one of the oldest thought experiments in the world. What would you do if you knew you were dying? How would you live your life? Then comes the recognition we are all dying. Probably not today or tomorrow, but someday. How then should we live? That's what this book is about, really living before we die. So, there you go. And then, of course, it goes on. But it's only, it's actually a relatively short book. Typed, it's only 150 pages, so it's going to be pretty small. Okay.
When does it come out?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I'm thinking of people I want to give it to.
I have beta readers reading it now, and then I have some people writing endorsements, and then it'll go to the publisher and the proofreading. But, hopefully maybe by the end of the year. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so we're going to do discipleship or studying under Jesus. Three things to keep in mind in this chapter, but in all the chapters, and anytime you ever open that thing called Bible. Well, New Testament. Their language, it's Greek. Wasn't written in English. Something is lost in translation. I guarantee it. I was reading today and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much lost. The culture, it's Jewish. Jesus is a Jew. Most of his followers are Jews. It's very Jewish. And we'll see what all that means. And then their setting, the Roman occupation. Some people call that background, but the more I thought about it, that'd be like saying in 2020, COVID was our background. It was our life. It was just life. Well, that's how the Roman occupation was. I mean, do you remember how you couldn't have a conversation without someone saying something about COVID? You couldn't have a conversation without talking about Rome. Their soldiers were everywhere, and every policy they enforced was just constant bearing down on you. There were different strategies on how to cope, but that's where it was. So in this case, the Greek word for disciple or follower, we already talked about this, one who takes on a way of life. The Jewishness of Jesus as a rabbi who's calling these fellow Jews. And so everything that gets raised, we have to think, okay, but what does this mean through Jewish ears or Jewish eyes? And then following Jesus meant challenging Rome. You weren't following the empire. You weren't following Caesar, who really did want allegiance. I mean, you didn't have to, it's not like the book of Daniel. You didn't have to bow down when they played the music or something. But you had to go along. And if you went along with Jesus, he was very much in opposition to Rome. That's kind of been hidden from a lot of people's eyes for a long time, but it's very much there. So we'll keep those things in mind. Okay, so this chapter on discipleship or following Jesus begins with this epigraph by Parker Palmer. The life I am living is not the same as the life that wants to live in me. I like that quote. I think it fits pretty well with the chapter. And then I also begin with a line from Fred Craddock, who said, if you kind of want to summarize what it means to follow Jesus, here it is. Come just as you are. Seriously, just as you are is perfectly fine. Just don't expect to stay that way. Well, that's Fred. He was always so good at that. It's pithy, but it is extremely accurate. I read all kinds of literature on discipleship, all this scholarly stuff. It's all that really it says over and over again is he called this wild bunch of diverse folks just like they were, but it was not going to let them stay there. So in a sense, that's really how the chapter gets outlined. There's this kind of, let's look at how the diversity of it. Let's look at the challenges. What does that mean for us? So I started that chapter with 3 stories that we're going to look at in the Gospel of Mark. And you'll notice how we're only 16 verses in to the Gospel of Mark, which doesn't have a birth story. And 16 verses in, he's calling disciples. That, you could say, is primacy. That comes pretty early. And then we'll look, next chapter, Jesus calls a toll collector, and the next chapter, among the 12, is a zealot. So we'll kind of look at these stories and see what you think. All right, so here you go. You got to do some work here. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I'll make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in the boat mending the nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired man and followed him. Any questions? Yes?
Yeah, this is something I've always wondered. What was it about Jesus that they would just meet and Jesus would say a few things and they'd get up and follow him? What was it that they saw?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know the answer to that, right? There's all kinds of speculation, and a lot of it's a little bit superstitious or suspect, like he must have had some kind of great charisma. And it's true, if you've been around people that have great charisma, they can woo you. It's just like, even if you don't want to, They could sell you any car on the lot. You're just like, I know it's a piece of junk, but it just felt like the right thing to do, and you're driving it home. I don't tend to subscribe to that theory. I think in some ways we're asking a question they weren't interested in when they wrote it. And that's because that wasn't the way they think. What Mark's doing is Mark's writing 30 years after Jesus. He's been gone 30 years. He didn't know Jesus. Wasn't there. But he knows these stories. And what he wants to say is, this is what Jesus is up to. He's calling people. He doesn't get into the psychological questions that we would ask, which again goes back to their culture versus ours. I'd love to know, because, if I'm fishing and some guy comes up and says, follow me, well, who the heck are you? Can I see your credentials? But there must have been some word spreading and so forth, so who knows?
And he probably actually said a few more words than that.
And said what?
A few more words.
Yeah,
than are
probably
written
so.
down.
We'll never know, right?
No.
Mark probably wanted to get on with it to the next thing. He was always speeding through things.
How do you see that in this story?
Well, immediately.
Yeah, twice, right? You see it?
Right.
And immediately.
And so he probably didn't know any more about it than what he says.
Yeah, well, he's definitely, whether he does or doesn't, he is definitely showing you the urgency. This is going to happen. What do you know about fishermen? Where would you put them in the social ladder of the first century?
Pretty low.
Yeah, it's pretty low. It's just the ordinary person, which is pretty low.
Shepherds.
Yeah, they're not despised. Fishermen aren't. They provide food. People buy fish from them. They pretty much have a subsistence living. They're not thinking about, we sell this boat and buy a bigger one, we can franchise. They're not thinking that way. They're catching however many fish they catch, which feeds their family, and they're selling some. But they're ordinary people. They're certainly not aristocrats, right? There's nothing special about them. And you do see here too something that will eventually come out when Jesus will say in Mark's gospel and elsewhere, you're going to have to decide about familial ties. They leave dad in this business. That's a pretty radical thing to do in the first century. In the 21st century, we say, when are you going to get out of here and get a job? First century, see, and that's why I say the cultural difference. You have to keep thinking first century values, not 21st century.
Well, and also where they were. There are still cultures that expect their children
Yes.
to live with
Right.
them until they marry or
Mhm.
something.
Yeah, even in the Holy Land. All those homes that have the wires sticking up that say, we're going to build on as soon as you have kids, we're going to build on because this is how it works. It's very nuclear, yeah.
Is there, I'm thinking of it in two ways, Jesus commanding them now, them thinking we've got to go now, and the motivations for the immediacy.
Mm.
Why is Jesus urging that it be now, and why do they see it? Are their motivations different?
No, it's the urgency of Mark, but it's also the urgency of Jesus, because one of the first things he says is, the time is now.
Right.
The time is now. The kingdom's come. It's time to go. And so he's got an urgency that Mark has that he then says, at least to these people. He doesn't always have this urgency. We'll look at some examples where it's not as urgent. Okay, so here's the next one. Just a few verses later, actually. Jesus went out again beside the lake. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he got up and followed him. All right, so what do you know about this one, or what stands out for you?
Well, a tax collector was way different than a fisherman.
Tax collector is way different from a fisherman. How so?
Well, a tax collector worked for Rome, right?
Tax collector worked for Rome. So remember, Roman occupation is everything, every day. Those sons of you-know-what, we're going to get them out of here. God's going to run them out. It ruins their lives. And so what some Jews chose to do was to go to work for Rome. because they could make a living. They might have resented Rome. Some of them might have not cared one bit, but some of them might have resented it but said, hey, it's just a way to make a living. It's no big deal, right? So you can imagine the nuances of that. But tax collectors, or more accurately, toll collectors, they could make up the amount of toll that's due. You're pulling up with your wagon of stuff. Okay, well, you owe us this many shekels. What are you going to do? If you don't pay, you're going to debtor's prison. You had no choice, and they could totally make it up. And what they did is they skimmed off and they passed along. But this is not good, right? I mean, to call a toll collector, for a Jewish rabbi to call a toll collector was astonishing. Fishermen, you know, okay, yeah, it's not the cream of the crop, but this is the normal person. Toll collectors, this is shocking. This, in my opinion, is one of the things that's going to get him killed, because he's going to convert toll collectors. They're not going to work for Rome. And when you mess with the economy, Rome comes after you. They don't care if you tell Beatitudes. They don't care if you tell parables. But when you mess with the economy, we saw this with Martin Luther King and civil rights. They're messing with the economy now. We got a bus boycott. We got a garbage strike. Economy gets people's attention.
So, was Levi a Jew?
Yes.
Mike, what
Good
percentage,
Jewish name.
Well, I know, I mean,
Yeah.
now it seems that way, but
Yeah.
what percentage of the population was Jewish? How can we look at that?
Well, overwhelmingly Jewish within Israel, but not exclusively. And you know, you have the Samaria region in roughly the middle of the country that's half Jewish and half that married during the exile. And then you have proselytes who come along, God-fearers who, but yeah, I mean, it'd be overwhelmingly, I don't know the exact percentage. I do know that they estimate 97% of the people were just getting by living, you know, on the standard of living, but I don't know exactly what it'd be overwhelming though. So, you know, you could even ask, again, questions we don't have the answer for. Why does a toll collector say, okay, you know, he's got bunches of money, he's doing just fine, Rome's taking care of him, but this is what he does. The next passage there, I just included simply to show you that Simon the Canaanian, elsewhere referred to as Simon the Zealot, Jesus calls a zealot. So what's a zealot? Well, these are the people who decided in the face of Roman occupation, I'm not going to fish and I'm not going to collect tolls, I'm going to kill them. Now, the formal zealot movement comes a little bit later, but this would be a precursor to it. So, for instance, some of the zealots were called Sicarii. Sicarii is the Greek word for a dagger, a knife. And they would, in their robes, you know, with their hands folded into the sleeves of their robes. I don't do this on Sunday in my robe, by the way. They'd have a dagger, and they'd just walk through the busy marketplace. And, you know, as you're walking by the Roman soldier, you just stick it in his back and keep walking. Nobody knows who did it. This was a way to kill Roman soldiers. So the zealots were people who by force were going to take it back. Jesus, yeah, he's got the fisherman, but he's got at the same table a toll collector and a zealot. They have radically different politics.
Your listing there of the 12 is only 11.
Well, in that case, I left one off. So probably, okay, yeah, Judas. Well, that must be symbolic, leaving him off. He's going to, you know, although in the Gospel of Mark, he doesn't really leave, you know, it's different. Okay. We did a pretty good job with that. All right, so here's another story. This is from Luke 18. I'll just call him the rich ruler. Sometimes people call him the rich young ruler. If you call him the rich young ruler, you've taken two gospel stories and put them together. The Luke version, he's rich and he's a ruler. All right, so let's just see if we can reconstruct what we think we remember about it before we read it. What happens? What does he say? He asks Jesus a question.
What must I do?
What must I do to what? Inherit eternal life. Very good. And Jesus says, heck if I know. No, what does he say? No, before he gets to that, he says, well, what's written in the law? How do you read it? And he cites the commandments, right? So when you get the commandments, Jesus says, well, okay, there's this one thing you lack. Go and sell all you have, and come follow me. And what happens? He goes away sad. Okay, you did pretty well, but you combined all those into one, which is really common. It's really common. And some people go, well, what's wrong with that? That's the way you should do it. No. It's not the way you should do it. That's called harmonizing the Gospels. You don't harmonize the Gospels. You read them separately. And if the story is in all three of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you start with Mark because he wrote first, and then you go to Matthew and Luke and go, ooh, look how they changed this. Look how they changed that. Because Matthew and Luke probably have a copy of Mark and a copy of some other document we don't have. So then you go, oh, so they've changed this, and you start to see. And they're not historians, they're theologians, and they want to make a different point than the other. And so Luke's point's really interesting. Okay, so here it is. What must I, good teacher, we forgot that part. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments. Jesus is citing them here. In the others, sometimes it's the person. And so we get the commandments. He replied, I've kept all these since my youth. Now, when he says that, he doesn't mean he's sinless. No Jew would think that. But he would keep these commandments. That's true. He would. I mean, does he bat 1,000? No, but he keeps these commandments. That's the way he lives. This is the law. I mean, of course that's the way he lives. But Jesus says there's still one thing lacking. Sell all that you own and distribute the money to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. But when he heard this, he became sad, for he was very rich. Okay, so what do you notice? Maybe I pointed out, maybe I didn't. Anything else stand out?
Well, the fact that he didn't follow Jesus like all the others did.
Does that say that?
Well, it says that he walked away sad.
Yeah, it doesn't say he walked away. Mark and Matthew have him leave. Luke sort of has him hang around. He's sad because, well, he just heard what's going to be required, and he's looking at his portfolio, and it's like, okay, but he doesn't leave. And the fact that Luke changes his leaving sort of implies he's a hanger-oner. Maybe, maybe not. By the way, we didn't point this out, but when Jesus calls the toll collector, he makes it clear there was a crowd, but he isolates this one toll collector. Crowds in the Gospels are kind of on the edge, and they could become followers or they could stay out. This guy's he's kind of in the crowd now, and we don't know, in Luke's version, is he going to, at some point, maybe change his mind? Maybe when Zacchaeus has his little moment, which is where we're going to go next. Okay, well, no, we're not going to go there next. We'll come back to it. Something similar, I think, happens, and I preached on this a week ago Sunday. The Nicodemus story, chapter 3, comes to Jesus in the night. Well, you know, you're going to have to be born from above. And it's just sort of left open-ended. Does he not? He comes at night. Chapter 7, he hedges his bets and says, well, you know, to the council, Nicodemus says, well, we probably shouldn't find him guilty until we give him a trial. And then in 19, when Jesus is dead, he comes with all these burial spices. So really good scholarship has said, this is not clear. Does he become a follower, or does he always just sort of hang back? And that's one way to read the rich ruler in Luke. Does he hang back, or does he finally say, okay, I'm in? And, as I noted the other day, this is the way it's constructed so that we're having to ask that question of ourselves. Are we going to hang back, or are we going to just dive in? Okay, so circles of discipleship. This is where it gets really kind of interesting. I've kind of hinted at this. You could sort of have these concentric circles, and I mentioned these crowds that are out here, and outside of that you could have enemies and so forth. But inside circles kind of interesting. Jesus has 12 disciples or apostles. They're called apostles in the first three Gospels. John won't call them apostles because he wants an egalitarian kind of community. But Jesus doesn't say to everybody, sell your stuff and come follow me. Some of them he doesn't say even sell anything, and some of them he doesn't even say you have to leave. Well, I'm not real thrilled with that if I'm the rich ruler. But like the wealthy women, if you've never looked at this, you can look at the first 4 verses of Luke 8. There's this list of women. They have means, and they support the ministry of Jesus financially. So Luke, he sends very mixed signals, Luke does, about the role of wealth. And I'll just give you my theory here in a second, but Mary and Martha is another example. They're very good friends with Jesus. He's close to them and their brother Lazarus. But they host him in their home, they feed him, and he never says, you need to give all this away. What you going to eat, Jesus? You come here all the time and have dinner parties. So my own take on this is that this circles of discipleship is there's no one set pattern. Like when he says there's one thing lacking. Well, what's that one thing? I don't think it's the same for everybody. In fact, it even says if you do this one thing, though, in this case, it uses the language of you can have treasure in heaven, but some of them say, like in Matthew, it says, if you do this one thing, you'll be complete. You will be flourishing if you'll just do this one thing. Well, I don't think that one thing's the same for everybody. I think if it's a relationship, if you're studying under Jesus, Jesus doesn't have a cookie cutter for all the people studying. So that's my own take.
I've also thought sometimes that maybe that was the thing that for the rich man, he had to show that he really cared and really did want to follow him, and the only way he could do that because he was so rich was to give up his riches.
And then what would you say about the others that are rich? They're not...
The women?
Yeah.
Well, they were women.
But it's about your priority.
Yeah.
I mean, the rich man, he had too much focus on the wealth, and maybe the rich women didn't.
Yeah, we're reading a lot into it to say that he did.
Yeah, well, you read a lot into anything you read in the Bible.
Yeah.
Was it the point that he was to give to the poor?
Well, there's definitely what it's going to be used for. He doesn't just say liquidate your assets. It's going to the poor. Yeah.
What about the possibility that he had wife and children to think of?
Yeah, I don't know. We don't know.
Jesus probably knew what this man was holding on to, and it was his wealth.
Yeah, maybe. It doesn't say that, but... Well, okay, but now here's a contrast. Okay, where's the rich ruler in Luke? Chapter 18. Excuse me. We're in chapter 19. Don't think chapters. We're just a few verses later. Okay? A few verses. There's a guy named Zacchaeus. Let's reconstruct the story because surely you know the song. He was a wee little man. And what did he do? He climbed up a sycamore tree. For the Lord. Yeah. He wants to see Jesus. Who knows why? It doesn't say, but he wants to see him. So he climbs up because he's tall. He's short. Actually, the Greek's very ambiguous there. It could be he climbs up there because he's short. It could be because Jesus is short. The Greek reads both ways. Jesus is short, so he's not going to see him if he's on ground level. Going to have to get up to see this short Jesus. Okay, so there you go. But Jesus, in the parade, does what? Stops. Looks up and says, "For you're coming to my house today," right? Yeah, and yeah, I'm going to your house. He invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. And so they go to Zacchaeus' house, and Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." Okay. The rich ruler is only a few verses down the street from Zacchaeus. What does Zacchaeus do, by the way? What's his job? You're close. He's the chief toll collector. Only one mentioned in Scripture. So you got to have a pyramid scheme if you're going to have toll collectors. He's over the pyramid. That means he skims off of their skimming off. He is filthy rich. Filthy rich. I don't mean that just metaphorically, right? He has stolen from the poor. And now this rich ruler, I mean, does the ruler lead a bad life? I don't know. Some speculation there. But a few verses apart, one of them, sell everything you have. Zacchaeus, yes, voluntarily says, half my possessions to the poor. If I'm the rich ruler, excuse me, can I give half my possessions to feed the poor?
Yeah, but he's got to pay all that everybody's defrauded, which is probably everybody, 4 times as much.
Yeah, that's true. It just doesn't seem fair, though. But again, I just go back to, I don't think it is, set. I think it's a relationship. And I think every one of us looks to Jesus to say, okay, what does it mean for me to follow Jesus? What does that mean? And when someone else in our circle of influence says, and they want to kind of force theirs on you, I think that's not a fair read. Not everybody in the Gospels does the same thing, and yet they are called disciples or followers. Thoughts about that? Okay. The final part of the chapter deals with the track record of disciples then and now. So, and I start with a story about Maya Angelou. You may have heard it before. When she was given the Presidential Freedom Award, I think it was, by Obama, she was interviewed on the occasion, and she said to the interviewer, anytime someone says to me, "Oh, I'm a Christian," she says, "Already?" It's a process. And I think that's really very consistent with what the Gospels talk about, this kind of growing in the faith, learning from Jesus, studying under Jesus. It's a lifetime of growing. So it's interesting that, for instance, Mark, the disciples do not come off looking good. Matthew, they come off looking a whole lot better. So if you're going to, if you're looking in the listing of courses to take in the spring, you go, I think I'm going to take Matthew. He grades on the curve. Mark, he's very hard on him. And it's true, Mark's very, very hard on him. And the section that I used, there's no way I could even put it on a slide. It's 3 whole chapters long. Chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. Now, it's not all the verses in these chapters, but there's just a little snippet in 8, a snippet in 9, a snippet in 10. And here's how it goes. The snippet in 8, Jesus says for the first time in the Gospel of Mark, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. And what do you think Peter says? He rebukes him. It's not a good thing to do when you're studying under someone to rebuke them, right? I mean, it's just not a good thing to do. Chapter 9, Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. Second prediction. They argue over who's the greatest. They just don't get it, right? I mean, he's going to die, which is self-sacrifice. But they are very self-occupied. Chapter 10, he says, I'm going to die. They argue with themselves about who's the greatest. James and John come up and say, could we have the places on your right and left when you come into your glory? You know, like vice president and whatever. And of course, if you read the gospel, the place on the right and the left is going to be for two thieves on the cross. They have no clue what they're asking. Now, 3 chapters, snippets of them totally clueless. They are clueless. In fact, one of them it says, and they didn't understand what he said. Well, it's not like he's speaking in a language they don't know. They just can't grasp what he's about. But here's the way the whole section is put together. The story before this section and the story after it are about Jesus healing blind people. Okay, so just let that sink in. Jesus heals a blind man and tells 3 stories of disciples who are blind. And then he tells a story of a blind man who can see. The first one that he tells, you may or may not remember this story. It's a little weird. Jesus heals this blind man, and I think he puts mud or some such thing, and he says, "Can you see?" And the guy goes, "Well, people look like trees." And Jesus fixes it. Well, people get a kick out of it because, you know, it looks like it didn't work, and Jesus has to fix it. But some suggest, no, that's kind of what we're getting ready to see is it takes time for people to catch on. And then the third one, or the last story after these 3, is Jesus healing Bartimaeus, this blind beggar, who's blind, and Jesus walking by, and he says, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." You just had 3 stories of people who've been with him day in and day out, have no clue what he's about, and a blind man says, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He knows he's Son of David? How does a blind man know that? So it's just the contrast. And I love it because in Mark, as well as Matthew, even Mark, who's really not, grading on the curve, he's hard-nosed, he has this little phrase. Jesus says, "Do you not yet understand?" And it's the word "yet." You hear the grace in that? Just hang in there. You'll eventually get it. And of course, think about people reading this 30 to 40 years later. The point of these stories is not, oh, so Jesus did that on a Tuesday and he did this on a Thursday. No, the point of that is to see ourselves on the stage and to say, yeah, I've played that part. I've been thick. I've been slow to see what Jesus is really about. And so what I did in putting this first is to say, this stands for everything that we're going to look at that Jesus does. This is how we're meant to live. Because what does Jesus do? He feeds the hungry. He cares for the poor. He heals the sick. He teaches. He's all about justice. So this sort of sets the tone for what it means to follow him. Okay, so questions, comments, thoughts? What did you learn that you didn't know? What are you still thinking about that you...
The way those are all arranged, or the way you've described it, they're all arranged.
It's pretty cool, isn't it?
It is.
Do
I
we
might
know-
even buy your book.
Do we know if Jesus knew the disciples before he asked them to follow him?
We don't know, but there's a chance he did. There's a chance that, he walked by there every day, bought fish from them. We just don't know. Yeah.
The 12 disciples is symbolic of something. I mean, to me, he had a lot of followers.
Right.
So why did he?
It's meant to harken back to the 12 tribes of Israel. And so it's his new kind of, and that's a challenge when you say that, because it can sound like the old Israel no longer counts. But it's meant to be an honoring of it. These are the 12 tribes of Israel. Here are the 12 tribes of Jesus, kind of thing. That's the kind of notion that they're going for.
Where do you get that? Did you just make it up?
No, I didn't just make it up. Well, I mean, it's not going to...
It makes sense, but
Yeah, it's not going to be... You can't point to chapter and verse. It's just considered the best thinking as a Jew, and there are some numerological studies. There's people who that's their specialty, right? They have PhD in numerology of the New Testament. Well, I can tell you from experience, they make up a lot of stuff that you're like, no way. Where did you get that? But a lot of it is not made up. It's very sound. And so when you get to the number 12, it's sort of there. I mean, there's only so many numbers that are considered really special. 3 and 7 and 12 are key ones. 40 is a key one. Yeah, there's a few of those. Yeah.
How do you, it's hard for me to imagine that the disciples through 8, 9, and 10, and isn't there a story where they fall asleep?
Yeah, that's later, yeah.
Yeah, how can they be traveling with him every day?
Right.
See him do miracles, hear him talk in parables, and still be so dense? It just kind of stretches the imagination. Are they trying to convey a point beyond the one that you conveyed?
Yeah. Well, I guess the way I would answer it is, how do I do it? I do it all the time. I mean, I read the Bible, and then I go out, and I've got ashes on my forehead, and I'm sitting at the corner, and I pretend this man there has a sign that says, please, anything helps, God bless you, and I don't even look. How do I do that? I'm pretty good at it. And, and there's a passage that says, give to everyone who begs of you. Well, what Jesus meant by that was, and even if I said, no, exactly what he meant was, you should give to every single person that ever begs of you. Well, I'm not going to do it. I've proven that. So, I mean, we're very capable of that. I do think that the authors are trying to make that point. They're trying to say, you can be that close and not get it. And of course, I think Mark's also making the point that sometimes outsiders are more perceptive than insiders.
Right. You can get used to it.
Yeah.
In another study some years ago, the explanation was that the disciples were actually, people were gathering around worshiping like the disciples, like John had his group and Peter had his group and so forth. And so Mark makes them look stupid so that the people, come back to Jesus and not to the disciples.
Yeah, and that's possible. 1 Corinthians is written 15 years before the Gospel of Mark, and there are factions there that are saying, well, I'm following Peter, and I'm following, and then someone said, well, we follow Jesus. They had these factions. So it's possible that's...
Early denominations.
Yeah, early denominations. Been dividing ever since. Did I see another hand? I think we've answered all those questions. We've solved all of the dilemma of discipleship now. All right, no other questions, then thanks for coming. We'll do it again next week.